and I'm just really touched to be here today, and thanks and congratulate Xiao Yuan for the success and just the strength of this today's program, which is just a snippet of what she has organized. I'm pleased to be here once again next to my Hani. We've been kind of like a twin couple for the last couple of years, appearing together many times. I've been following her career for a while. Mariam Hani is an artist, writer, and teacher based in Brooklyn, New York. I'm going to skip most of her bio. It's quite impressive. You must look it up yourself. But I did want to just say some thoughts that I had written somewhere sometime that I found on my iPhone because my computer died last night. Born in New York to an Afghan father and Lebanese mother, Mariam Hani began exploring her artistic practices in Afghanistan, since we're talking about Afghanistan, although her practice also involves other subject matter and other places in the world. In 2000, with the motivation of an artist, a researcher, a documentarian, cataloger, an observer from the outside with intrinsic connection to the inside. Her projects in Afghanistan over the years have achieved a masterful balance between formal representation and significant narratives that unfold into compositions much larger than images alone. She operates with the mind of a painter, an architect, and a choreographer, while much like a scientist or a detective, sets out to decode various claims of truth through her exploration of the physical histories, as well as, of course, psychological histories. And since we have been on the subject of plagues and disease of particular places, to bring to light profound disconnections and buried realities. These prevailing examinations are particularly pronounced in her ongoing focus on Kabul as a site for the constant construction and reconstruction of concepts of space and identity. My own work has been around the notion of specificity and how that relates to the world at large. So most of my curatorial practice, while it starts with the starting point of Afghanistan and other countries in Central Asia, which have been isolated for decades and decades, at some point inherently had to be connected to Asia at large because, just the fact that we're here today is pretty phenomenal because normally when it comes to representation of Asia, especially in the United States, we just think of China, Japan, and Korea. An entire body of Asia is left out. So the fact that Afghanistan is in this panel today is quite revolutionary idea on its own. I'm going to pass the mic to Mariam so she can get on with her what I believe will be an extraordinary presentation, and hopefully I'll have some comments to make, and I'll open it up to you after this. Thank you.
Okay, should I use this microphone? Is this one working? Okay. All right. So thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be back at CCA again. Since I was here just last year, talking about one of my most recent projects in Afghanistan, which was the project of Brief History of Collapses, and I was also with Lisa last year at the Asian Art Museum talking about one of my other recent projects in Afghanistan Lexicon. And I also was at UC Berkeley last year talking about one of my other recent projects in Afghanistan, the Trespassers. I'm going to skip all of those today and talk about
super brave.
some other things instead. So you're going to get a glimpse into some lesser known parts of my work in and around Afghanistan, some of the earlier projects, and also some of the work around and feeding into some of those better known and kind of larger projects. So the kind of rubric under which I've collected all of this is Kabul reconstructions and speculations. Oops, that one. There we go. So there exists a kind of temptation for any artist who studies a city over a long period of time to stray into the territory of the historian, to construct linear progressions and explanations, or to adopt the techniques of the social scientists, classifying and categorizing any knowledge acquired, extrapolating from specifics to abstractions. So I try to frame my work more in terms of experimental geography, to take on Trevor Packlin's term, or as a form of speculative archaeology, even when documenting the city as it is, rather than researching the city as it was. I'm always looking for traces of the other cities within a city. Past cities, possible cities, cities inhabited simultaneously but separately by different groups of people with different formal relationships to its physical reality. When I first began making work in and about Kabul, that work was part of my first attempts to learn and somehow map a terrain that was both strange and familiar, distant and intimate. And Lisa talked about this a little bit in her introduction. So these were my first trips to a city that I had grown up with but not in. And this is kind of the paradox of being children of exiles. I knew the imaginary city of my parents' memories and of my family myths, but not the real Kabul that they now lived in because they had actually moved back there. And that wasn't the same Kabul that they remembered. It was a city that, like its hero, Rustam, had been burned to ashes and was being renamed. So it was impossible to pretend that the distance, this distance between the remembered and the real cities, or between the reunited parts of my family which had been scattered by war, didn't exist. So instead I tried to measure or reproduce or perform this distance within the work that I made. But the work itself began to kind of telescope this distance. So even when I was keeping the city at arm's length, which I did in, for example, this work, which is called Kabul 234, which is a kind of car-assisted daylong through the city of Kabul. I ended up learning the city, learning its pathways and its surfaces and its attitudes and rhythms. So I'm going to show you a little excerpt of this. Top channel here was filmed in 2004, the middle channel in 2003, and the bottom channel in 2002. And then the whole is edited together so that as much as possible you're always seeing the same streets at the same time within the video, but of course at a distance of a year in terms of when they were filmed. there's actually a real possibility of change. And there was a kind of ferment of different kinds of reconstructions happening in the city in that moment, including a new constitution being written, and there's a separate piece that I made which actually documents the Constitutional Assembly of 2004. As well as the emergency Zhejiang, which put together the transitional administration and a number of other kinds of political and social reconstructions, as well as, of course, the influx of so many returned refugees and the reconnection of so many different families like my own. So, over the years of both filming and editing this work, there was a process of kind of minimalizing the city. Although the city, of course, changed as I was in the process of making this document of it. But I learned to distinguish the open city from its closed quarters, the spaces where no car or camera could go, these kind of patchy green zones and red zones that were demarcated by concrete barricades and checkpoints, chain link and concertina wire. I saw the city creep upwards and outwards as this tide of returning refugees washed up onto the hills that surround Kabul's valley, where they actually ended up reconstructing in miniature their kind of territorial claims and disputes of all their original home provinces. So there followed a series of years where the actual distances grew much longer, and my visits to the city were few and far between. So I began to fill the gaps with trips into the records of the city's histories. These kind of photographic and filmed and textual archives where past versions of Kabul are preserved. And at the same time, I was undertaking a parallel research into the invisible aspects of present-day Kabul through declassified U.S. government documents about secret prisons, interrogation, and rendition practices in Afghanistan. That's part of what is The Trespassers, this other work that I'm not going to talk about today. But it's online if you want to look at it. And during this research in the archives, I came to understand how Kabul, like many capital cities, had always been physically constructed and reconstructed in the shapes of the Afghan state's political and social reconstructions. So from Amanullah's modernizing experiment of the 1920s, which produced the first half-finished, half-utopian planned neighborhood of daylong, which you see around this kind of military parade here, and which is the subject of that other work of Brief History of Collapses. One half of it is entirely about the experiment of daylong, to the later and more pragmatic planned neighborhoods of Kartachar and Kartasay. It's quarter 4 and quarter 3. Quarter 4 was actually built before quarter 3, and nobody knows why they're called quarter 4 and quarter 3 in that order. It's like one of those mysteries I was never able to solve. But those were built by Nader, the king who succeeded Amanullah, after a revolt unseated Amanullah because he undertook too many modernizing experiments. But Nader actually picked up some of his ideas and remade them in more kind of pragmatic forms. And he constructed these new planned neighborhoods using a similar idea that Amanullah had, which was basically that these civil servants could purchase a lot and then they could buy a plan. There was basically these 4 different plans, pre-designed houses. You bought a lot, you bought a plan, and then the government sold you the supplies at cost to build the house. So this is the way that all of the kind of solid middle-class neighborhoods of mid-century Kabul were constructed. all of the housing for this kind of civil service, which was also an invention of Ahmad's. He invented the Afghan civil service. He basically wrote all the laws that created the bureaucracy and then built it up. So that's what Kartachar looked like in the 30s. And then as the finance minister, Ahmed Majid Zabali, started to build up in the 40s. He started to build up the central bank and the Merchants Association and other market institutions, all on the back of Karakul, which is, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Karakul. Karakul is the wool of fetal lambs, and it used to be extremely popular. My grandmother, not my Afghan grandmother, but my Lebanese grandmother actually had a whole Karakul suit like the one you see in this fashion show that was held in the Kabul Hotel in the 1960s. But Karakul was like a monopoly export of Afghanistan in the mid-century, and on the back of the Karakul trade, Afghanistan constructed its entire kind of market economy in the 40s and 50s. So that's when these kind of more luxury neighborhoods, like Wazir Akbar Khan, which was originally built for foreign diplomats, were constructed. And the central bank, which you see here, which was a kind of anchoring building of the grand avenues like Zhejiang. And this is a really cute illustration from government almanac of traffic control on Zhejiang in the 60s. Wazir Akbar Khan was actually also modeled on American suburbs of the 40s and 50s. Zabali was also responsible for building Kabul's first industrial zone. So this followed on the Karakul trade. They were able to start building up cotton trade and other kinds of industries. And then as Dawood, who was sort of he's a prime minister who's the avatar of Tarafi, which is this kind of peculiarly Afghan version of non-alignment, where it literally means playing both sides against the middle. So he was able to leverage both American and Soviet foreign aid. And the Soviet foreign aid went towards building projects like the microrayon, which you see here, which was prefab apartment blocks. And I was recently in St. Petersburg and driving through an area that used to be a suburb of St. Petersburg, which is now part of the city itself. But I saw a series of tower blocks which looked exactly like the microrayon, like exactly like them. It kind of freaked me out a little bit. But there were these prefab apartment blocks that started to be built in the 50s, and they didn't finish them until actually the 2000s. They didn't finish the 11th block until the 2000s, but they were really revolutionary at the time because they were the first stock of apartments in the city where young couples could live away from family compounds. And so they paved the way for the first waves of love marriages in the 60s and 70s. These are the Zhejiang Independence Day celebrations in the late 60s. So once I knew these past deeds, I began to recognize traces of them in the present, existing alongside and in between the newer strata. And this is how we get from then to now. But one of the things you can still see is these old kocha, which I showed you back at the very, very beginning. The kocha are these narrow lanes. Yeah. They're the narrow lanes, which could be closed with a gate, and the gate was called a kochagi. And the kochagi was a term that also came to denote neighborliness and ties within social networks outside tribe and family. So the kocha survived some in their original form, and this is the Kochai Karabati, which this is an image of it from the late 70s, but it actually still exists, and Kochai Karabati means the alley of the musicians, and it is still a place where musicians live. And a lot of the really old neighborhoods in old Kabul were all named for professions, because that's the way that they were organized. But now you still see something like the Kocha, which have survived in the newest neighborhoods, these newly built neighborhoods, in the new sprawling Kabul, where these kind of new forms of neighborliness or kochagi are being constructed. And there we go. These poplars, which once lined the road to Daylong, which I may or may not have an image of. There used to be a grand arch of poplars lining the road to Daylong, where my family lives now. And you can actually see them there in that road. Yeah, that's the poplars lining the road to Daylong, and they were so tall that they actually completely covered the road. It was like a shaped arch. So they were completely cut down for firewood during the war years, and they've been replanted now, actually by the ministry. This is when they were cut down. And they've all been replanted now by the Ministry of Roads and Rural Development. This is one of those memories that really persisted. People always talked about riding their bicycles down that long, shady alley to Daylong. And so that was such a strong kind of memory that those were among the first trees to be planted in Kabul in the 2000s. This is the road to Daylong in 2006. This part of it, the trees haven't grown too well on, but in the earlier part, they're pretty good. These are election posters in 2007. Campaign culture in Afghanistan is kind of a strange thing because there didn't used to be direct elections. So the campaign season only lasts about 2 weeks, or it did in the first direct election. It only lasted about 2 weeks. It's a very different kind of campaigning, and it doesn't seem to have much effect on the results at all. It's not why people vote for who they vote for. Another thing that you can see kind of persisting from the old Kabul to new Kabul is the gardens. And unfortunately, a lot of these images are from winter, so you can't really see it. But the garden of the Emperor Babur, this Persian emperor, was another really early project. It was replanted by the Aga Khan Foundation. This is the Timur Shah mausoleum, which they also restored. But they replanted that, and it reproduces on a kind of grand scale the replanting of many smaller walled gardens where there are roses and almonds and pomegranates now blooming every spring. And these kind of mid-century middle-class villas, Karkasay, which you can see kind of underneath here in this hodgepodge of roofs. And that's the fort from earlier. The walls of that fort remaining. These mid-century middle-class villas are still persisting. They're still surviving alongside these poppy palaces, which you see here.
Cake house.
The wedding cake houses is another word for them, which have been built by the drug czars, the czars of the new illegal economy. This is actually a neighborhood that was built on illegally seized land. It was government land that was taken over by members of the government. It's a neighborhood called Shirpur. And then they built these enormous wedding cake houses on it, and then they rented them out. Yes, indeed. Education. And then, we still have for one reason or another, persists unreconstructed. They're tears in the urban fabric. And I'm always interested in these places where you see the old and the new kind of stubbornly coexisting alongside each other. Where you see these kind of massive new crazy real estate developments and then the very old dog mud walls side by side. So the more intimate you become with a city, the more difficult it can be to see it as you did when you were the stranger come to town. When your perception was sharpened by the unfamiliar air, even though your understanding was, of course, also blunted by your inability to place all those details you were constantly noticing into the continuum of their actual context. So one way to kind of detour a familiar city is to drift through it randomly on someone else's directions, photographing on pure visual instinct without stopping to analyze the images until the drift is finished. And so I did this during the summer that was just past, and these are the photographs we're looking at now. And then I kind of looked over these photographs, trying to read them for signs of Kabul's uncertain future. These are the speculations part of the talk. So this is the hazy time after the 2014 military withdrawal, which may signal another destruction or another renewal. Or both. Yes, I know, these are amazing, aren't they? We have all these malls now in Kabul. So we used to have markets that were held in shipping containers when I first came back in 2002, and now we have massive green glass, 5-story malls with unnecessary sculptures in front of them. Which says something. I'm not sure exactly what it says, but it says something. So to me, this is what these images suggested. Okay. If Paris was Benjamin's capital of the 19th century, emblematic of the kind of grand Haussmann-style planned city with its avenues and its arcades, Kabul might be considered a capital of our atomized and anarchic 21st century, which is a city grown from 200,000 to more than 6 million in just over a decade, where almost 3/4 of the housing is illegal or informal, where black, white, and gray markets operate simultaneously and constantly bleed into each other, where the obscenely rich and the desperately poor, as well as everyone in between, live cheek by jowl. That graffiti actually says Yankee go home in English. Yeah. And the rich and the poor are perpetually proximal, but rarely touching. One is going through the streets in armored cars, and the other is literally lying in the gutters. Maybe looking up at the stars, maybe not. Kabul's future destruction is endlessly surmised from without, and sometimes also promised from within. But even a casual glance around the city reveals much more construction than destruction. A positive fever of construction, in fact. Some ramshackle, some supposedly luxury class, but very little of it likely to survive an earthquake, though one might arrive at any moment from the fault underneath the city. And unfortunately, some of it very likely to wash away in the next spring flood. On one level, this fever of construction is speculation. And it's probably spurred by the artificial inflation of real estate prices in Kabul, a bubble that is already starting to burst with the loss of foreign funds from NGOs and military, which, for many years have been circulating through the economy and very soon will not be. On another level, it's speculation of a different sort. It's a bet that the city will survive the coming crisis, whatever form it may take. It's a concrete hope that whatever you build will not just be torn down again. This is a wedding hall. There are these kind of fantastic wedding halls. I can't even explain to you how amazing they are. It's a bet on the future that there will be one, and it's a bet on survival rather than more death.
Wow, I didn't even have to pressure you to end. Honestly, I'm incredibly shocked because Mariam has enormous amounts of images accumulated through her numerous projects in Afghanistan since 2003. Is that when you first went there? 2002. So when she was telling me on the phone the other day that she is going to, she's struggling to narrow it down. And, I've been...
Did I narrow it down too much? Is that what happened?
No, I think you did marvelously well because it's true. There is a lot that you have done. I just find myself stunned in response to this set of imagery because I've been working a lot with you in the content of the material that you have been digging up on more historical aspects of the city, Kabul, although you shared here some aspects of it. But so I'm just going to, first of all, make one comment. One being that beyond, as a curator myself, beyond the politics and the specificity of the subject, which is very much something that is personally very important to myself, being that I'm from Afghanistan as well. The first most important thing that attracts me to Mariam's work and why I follow her work is also the fact that she's an artist. At the end of the day, the work is art. There's an aesthetics to it. There's a study and exploration of formalism as well. And so within the narratives and the politics and the archiving, there is also the love of imagery and image making, which is a very important thing to point out here, because we are here talking about contemporary art. And I also just wanted to mention that Xiao Yu's very, very positive sort of this imagination that through the Google map and the dropping of a pin, we can connect to all these places in the world quite quickly, all at once. It's both brilliant and simultaneously naive, given that we are witnessing all the different isolated things that we have we've been completely isolated from in terms of information. I really wish that James was still here because his anger and this personal sort of feeling that this whole story about China was being ignored because there's so many people in China, so that's why the Chinese don't matter. But I think it's just the fragmentation that has been created by the political and the geography of the world in the last 200 years, which has completely isolated us from what probably more than now, even in history, was a lot more connected, a much more connected world than we think it is today. And of course, the panel today, I feel like, is more of an example of that isolation and also what we were talking about last night with Ufan, who talked about time and space, and the more cities get built and the more technologies are created for us to live life supposedly more conveniently, the more isolated we actually become, and the scale is not human scale. At the end, it's a programmed living that has nothing to do with reality. So that's kind of like the overall comment about the drop-in. But the question I have for you, Mariam, which was a question that kept ruminating in my mind when I was hearing the other panelists, was, all right, so these plagues, these diseases that we're talking about, inhumanity, because we're not talking about just one place. It's been, if it's not Afghanistan, it's Cambodia, it's China. It's been happening in many different places in different forms, and I have been trying to really think of this from that step that you said that you take a bit back. And instead of looking at it from an outside perspective of who has imported this, to questioning what was the internal ingredient of this collective memory that allows for these kind of things to also cultivate, in a sense. So, for example, maybe I can bring Tamim Ansari, who talks about buzkashi, and buzkashi is this crazy, sport in Afghanistan where basically, these horsemen run around and there's this ferocious game that has absolutely no rules. It has never had rules. It's not written. In a sense, it's completely different from any sport that is institutionalized in the West. And that buzkashi is a representation of the Afghan collective, in a sense, because there's this game that has been going on. It's an internal game, given that the collective is itself, unlike the example of Hong Kong and mainland China, there is both classicism and multi-different ethnicities and tribes and languages that come into play that make it quite complex. And then there's this modernism, which was all about this game of modernism, which is all about rule making, and the Afghan collective having to have their take a grip on this with all these disruptions and interventions, which is what many of the projects today did speak about, point two. And so that particular internal game with no rules, trying to make up rules in this modern world, played against a completely other kind of game that is the outside world, the superpowers, and their own very much, the rules that they make up that continuously they break, and how that affects Afghanistan constantly. So I guess the question to me is if for your work and through your work you've been able to touch on that internal ingredient that maybe makes Afghanistan susceptible to this constant construction, deconstruction, disruption, and hope and despair and death.
Wow, that's a big, big question. Well, let me just say a relationship to buzkashi, that we're not showing it tonight as part of the Afghan Films program, but in the Afghan Films archive, there is an amazing film called Epic of Love, which is basically Romeo and Juliet with rival buzkashi teams. 3 hours long, but it is incredible. I don't think we have the entire film online, but we have some really, really unbelievable clips in the Afghan Films Online Archive of Patna, which I recommend checking out. It's one of the most beautifully lensed films in the Afghan Films Archive. It's one of the earlier color films, and it's like there's this whole scene where the Juliet figure is like running through this field of poppies. It's just like, it's just insane. Okay, anyway. Yeah, that's just a digression on Bozkashi. Well, I mean, this was one of the subjects of A Brief History of Collapses, was the idea of this kind of constant cycle of attempts at modernization, which provoked revolts, collapses, reconstruction, new attempts, new revolts, new collapses, new reforms, and so on and so forth. And one of the big hypotheses of that project is that it's a cycle that starts in the 1920s with King Amanullah. And it starts with him because his project is left unfinished, because he sets forth an entire, quite radical and even utopian project, and within 10 years he creates the entire modern Afghan state. But then at the very end of his reign in 1928, he holds a jirga, this Afghan assembly, the assembly of all the tribal elders, where he lays forth an even more ambitious program of reform, where it really would have overturned many of the long-standing traditions of the state. And among other things, it proposed to do away with every single privilege of every group that had supported him. So he wanted to take away the salaries of the royal family. And they used to have like meals delivered to them, and all kinds of things. He was going to do away with that. He was going to reclaim the lands, the waqf, the lands that were given to all of the Muslim, like the rural Muslim like mullahs had land grants. He was going to repossess all of those and taking over the state, so that took away all of his religious support. I mean, he was proposing a whole set of reforms that basically led to a revolt. But if he had managed to carry them through, it would have made Afghanistan one of the more modern places in the world at that time, especially if he had managed to finish building Dar-Laman, which if you look at the codes, the building codes set forth to plan Dar-Laman, this city to the west of Kabul, they're incredibly forward-thinking even today. They would still be forward-thinking by our standards today in terms of the amount of green space that was decreed by regulation, the relationship of houses to private space to public space, the proportions of public space to private space, the idea of commons, the insistence on green space, and of course this kind of revolutionary idea, which was picked up by later rulers, of selling the plot and the plan, and then selling the materials at cost, because all the materials, the building materials, had been actually bought by the state and then were passed on, bought and bought by the state and then were passed on to the land buyers at cost. So it made it very affordable for everybody. It would have been quite something to be done. In any case, so there's a number of his ideas which then are picked up again by later rulers and later reformers, including Dawood in the 50s and 60s, who is the one who finally manages to institute the lifting of the veil.
Although the law was passed.
Yeah, the law was passed in the 1920s by Amanullah, but it doesn't actually happen until Dawood. It doesn't become a,
Illegal.
yeah, it doesn't become an actually widespread practice until Dawood. And then land reform is attempted again by the Afghan communists in 1978 and 79, and that's one of the reasons that, that's actually one of the major reasons that there's such a huge rural revolt against them, just as there was against Amanola, because it's such a fundamental threat to the rural power structures. So.
Yeah, no, of course that question is tremendously large, and I don't think that I meant to ask that question thinking that, you know, you will have an answer, or I will have an answer, or anyone, but the intention of that question is to sort of go back to that Asian continental philosophy, you know, from Confucius to Zen Buddhism to Sikhism, self-knowledge, know thyself. And so the constant, the way that we understand the world today is through the processes in place by popular media and various other channels that always generalize and dumbify information. And you know, the works of artists like Mariam, you, and James, and curator, I forget his name. Yeah, you know, it is about the specificity of knowledge and its layers, and how much of that is hermetic to all of us. And the responsibility, someone asked the question, so what's our responsibility? Is, I think that is to look much further and look much more inside. And so for me, the value of what you do as an artist and the subject that you're working with is tremendous, because you are giving access to information and opening up a process of self-analyzation, which is something that almost, it's a universal, our universal tendency is to break things down from looking and towards some other direction for the answer. But a lot of the answers are actually within the histories of the places and its own dynamics, and the dynamics of how they relate to the larger world and the larger politics of the world. And I feel that that's a much more powerful way of just connecting to the world, rather than breaking them down into these categorical understandings. I want to just ask you one question, particularly about one of my favorite projects that you've done, and I know you didn't. We have enough time, I think, for you to just talk about it a little bit. It's the trespassers piece, and I have to say that it's for me it's one of the most poignant works that you've done, because it's the experience of the Afghan diaspora who not only were traumatized by having to become refugees and come to the United States during the 80s. Someone talked about how SARS is like how there's a point of reference to discussing Hong Kong, becomes a point. Well, unfortunately, 9/11 has become that wall that divides and does not allow anyone to look beyond what happened before. But because of 9/11, so many Afghans were hired, employed by the U.S. government to go back to Afghanistan as translators for the U.S. military. And I just wanted to kind of get your take on, because that project was, in a sense, very different from this project. Or or the reconstruction? And if you can talk about why, because it felt personal as well.
Well, I mean, I talk about a lot of my work as being partial reconstructions or reconstructions from partial information. And that project is very much in that vein because it's a narrative that's completely constructed from declassified official documents, which are, of course, riddled with redactions. And they're full of just these visual blackouts, these omissions of information. So the entire, it's a 105-minute video, which is made up entirely of a magnifying glass reading documents line by line. And at the same time, you hear on the soundtrack simultaneous translation of these documents into Arabic and Dari. And all the documents are about, they're kind of moving this decade-long narrative of the intersections of treason, translation, and trespassing, the global war on terror. There's an acronym for you, GWAT is what they call it in the documents, GWAT. With a focus on the role of translators in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, a lot of these translators were recruited from the diasporas in the United States, and it's in fact the diasporic translators who play the most important roles in interrogations because they were the only ones who had security clearance high enough to participate in interrogations, and particularly in high-level interrogations. You had to be a citizen to have that kind of security clearance. You had to be a U.S. citizen. I've spoken to actually Afghan citizens who worked as translators for the U.S. military in Afghanistan for 5 years, and had very strange, but they can come out really odd at the end of that. They look like GIs, but they're Afghans. It's really weird. Buzz cuts, like background-based T-shirts, like serious, like Texas accents in their English. But they're Afghans. Anyway, and they were never allowed to translate in interrogations. They only translated in like day-to-day prison operations, things like that, or during raids. And it was always the translators who came over from the diaspora who translated in interrogations. And one of the really problematic things about this is that most of the translators who were recruited from the Afghan diaspora, this is really a problem in Afghanistan in particular because for Iraq they had a much larger pool to draw from in terms of like an entire Middle East diaspora to recruit from, and not just an Iraqi diaspora, but in Afghanistan it's a fairly specific diaspora. They mostly recruited from the second generation of immigrants because the first generation thought it was not a good thing to do. They looked on it as a kind of treasonous act. And the second generation was not actually that fluent. Their Dari wasn't that great, and their Pashto was almost non-existent. And a lot, in fact most, of the detainees were Pashto speakers and didn't really speak Dari. Many of them didn't speak Dari at all. So there was a huge problem with the translation in Afghanistan. And the documents are riddled with this. You can really, really see it. All the problems that arise even in everyday translation, where a translator is constantly making choices about what to include and what to leave out, just multiply when you're thinking about them in a situation where the translation has so much weight and consequence. And then when you think about the fact that one person is getting interrogated 5 times a day or 10 times in a week, but it's not the same translator every time, and the different translators make different choices, and consistency is one of the things you're getting interrogated for, right? Consistency is one of the things they check for. But your translators are translating what you say differently every time. So even if you're saying it the same way, it's not being translated the same way. I mean, that's a huge problem, and it actually came up a lot in the documents. That's just a small example of many, many things that I found out.
Yeah, so there's a small place right there, which is quite large actually, if you think about it, because it's also the double trauma of the ones who, even if they are second generation, carry that from their parents, although there were some first generation that did also go, because the money that they get paid is extremely, it's just ludicrous how much they get paid to do this, and the trauma of having to go back to their homeland, but yet not be allowed outside the base. They basically just live inside the base with Americans and Afghan detainees and have absolutely no connection to life outside the base in their own country. Essentially eating a complete diet that has been also, imported by the military. So these are the stories that we can go on and on to discuss. They're quite revealing about the real important issues that Afghans face and are dealing with on a constant basis. But what I'd like to stop at and give you the floor to is the persistent hope. 5 million or so refugees that had left came back, and I interacted with them mainly because I was taking cabs all over the city, and these were the refugees who were able to speak in all these languages, and they were managed to get these jobs, and they were always saying, they would say, oh, we know there's going to be bloodshed, it's going to be horrible when the Americans leave, it's going to be a bloodshed. And I would say, well, do you have a plan? What are you going to do? Oh, I'm not going anywhere. I'd rather stay and live through this than have to go back outside the country. And to me, that's hope.
Well, there's a kind of amazing thing for me, which is that we talked a little bit about hierarchies of victimization and invisibility, and in Afghanistan, I think there's a sense, especially among the younger generation, that when the attention of the world turns away from Afghanistan, it won't be a good thing. That's people are kind of looking forward to it. Maybe then we can take care of our own.
So I think we have 8 minutes, right? Like about 8 to 10 minutes if you have any more questions.
So I'm wondering, as an artist who's working in such a heavily politicized space where there is the U.S. media and there is the State Department that's trying to kind of actively construct this more propagandistic narrative, how do you coexist with that narrative and do you try to complicate it?
Well, in terms of cultural diplomacy, the State Department has not been at all interested in contemporary art. They have worked exclusively with archaeological excavations and restorations of Islamic art. So the U.S. State Department in Afghanistan has not touched contemporary art at all. And I think that's been a very deliberate choice on their part because it's a little bit more of a touchy area. There's still quite a lot of censorship, and that can be more difficult, and that's why Documenta's project in Kabul was important though problematic, but it was still actually quite brave in a number of ways.
I just want to say I really appreciate both your presentations, but your work on I really see it as a contemporary archaeology, despite and also because of the insistent erasure of that one. And I was really interested, almost with the game of Hashi, made me think about a parallel. It's not the same, but like in Korean polo, where someone has to accelerate in order to actually precisely hit something. So there's a sense that you can accelerate in order to slow down. So that like, I feel like the moments you're showing, it's obviously an accelerated of Kabul, but it also has that slowness of like the moment before things turn and get hit, and so it's, or it open up in some way. And I wanted to know, in terms of the contemporary, like the pop music, for instance, or I mean, you show those amazing beauty images on the mall, and they're just so aspirational, and like people are really decked out, like extra, like uber decked out. And so I was just wondering, how is this moment of slowness and acceleration showing up in other parts of pop culture, maybe in music, or if you have more comments about that?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the things that is rarely visible or commented on outside of Afghanistan, is how much the rise of satellite television has impacted culture inside Afghanistan, because I think we're now up to, is it 32 or 42 Afghan satellite channels? 32? Yeah, there's 32 Afghan satellite TV channels, and that kind of multiplicity of perspectives and outlets has really pushed the discourse in a number of ways. It hasn't been as successful in creating a space for political discussion, although that is starting to happen. But what has really happened is that it's pushed the cultural boundaries in a number of ways. So whereas even 6 years ago, you would never see a woman without her hair covered on television or on the street or in an advertisement in a public space like that. Now it's very common. And there's a number of very well-known media presenters who are always seen unveiled in tight pants, in high heels. There's one pop music program where the woman is quite famously always dressed like that, and it's she's, pretty popular. There's some people who hate her, but there's a lot of other people who love her. There's the kind of quite well-known American Idol type program, Afghan Star, on Tolo TV. At this point, that's like a 4-year-old institution. And there's a lot of newer, more experimental formats.
I was going to say that if the elections were to be held in the way that, political elections would be held in the way that the Afghan Stars elections are held, which is through texting. Literally, the entire country texts for their favorite singer. And of course, there are these fascinating tribal wars that happen via the text world for their favorite singer from a particular province, from a particular tribe. And it's, in a way, it's a really healthy way of getting all that energy retention out, but also signifying just the fact that the reality, like, people just want to live. They just want to be entertained like anywhere else. Of course, many of us look down on it, have our opinions on it, because again, there is a whole process of demifying the popular sector that happens with this kind of invasion of media as well. Where the traditional literature and traditional entertainment channels of storytelling, oral storytelling, histories, and other formats, music gets, of course, affected by this. But that's the world. That's the reality of the world, and it's happening there as well.
But you see, it's really important to note the kind of technological leapfrogging that happens in countries like Afghanistan, where there's a complete destruction of certain infrastructures like landlines. And so instead, they build this amazing 3G network, which covers almost the entire country now. And everyone has smartphones, so you'll see like these old men pushing donkey carts who have smartphones. It's amazing. It's really incredible. And it really, it changes a lot of things. Yeah.
Maybe one last question?
I'm going to ask a hard question.
Okay.
So, I feel like there's a level at which what we're seeing in these images of reconstruction parallels
you talk more directly about how you might try to counteract that kind of behavior in your work. Because I think what happened is during the refugee period, it was largely the social elites who left the country because they could afford to and they had access to leave, and now they're coming back. So you have a society where there had been a whole generation raised almost without a social elite, and then suddenly this economic and social elite returns and starts transforming things. And when you talked about these reformations in the past, they were all sort of aristocratic reformations. And in a way, it feels like this is another aristocratic reformation. And even when you take that position of the flaneur is itself a sort of problematic character in history for that same reason. Housemanization was basically the first wave of urban gentrification, right? So can you just hit that a little bit more directly with respect to how you problematize it or how you try not to replicate that in the work that you're doing? And actually, I would open that to both of you, working in that community and coming from abroad, where we're all sort of looking at Asia from this perspective as a kind of default elite.
I mean, I think the thing that differentiates Kabul right now is the fact that so much of what you're looking at is actually illegal or informally constructed. It really is like almost 75% of the buildings in the country. So even things that look like luxury housing or new, very middle or upper middle class or even upper class developments, even gated communities are actually built on illegally seized land or squatted land. So everything that you're seeing is like a house of cards. And everything that's built on the hills is illegal. Every single house on the hills is illegal. And it also is all in flood zones and earthquake zones. Actually, almost all of Kabul is an earthquake zone.
I do want to say that the difference is actually that the refugees we're talking about that have come back, maybe the percentage, I don't have the exact percentage of like the so-called elite. The elite lives too comfortably in the United States, Canada, Germany, and other places. They will go in and out, but they are not the ones that actually live there. The refugees that we're speaking about who returned are those who went to live in Iran and Pakistan and other neighboring countries, suffering decades of prejudice, horrible lifestyles, and missing, detrimentally their country and returning to reclaim it. So the buildings that there is something that's happening that is very different. It's happening by all different classes of society that before wouldn't have had that chance. For example, the Hazara community, they have come back incredibly empowered by the fact that they lived and became educated and are very much resistant to the kind of prejudices that they would tolerate and would passive of for centuries in Afghanistan. You have that community that was I was shocked to go into the Hazara community on my own in these newly constructed neighborhoods where there was no running water or electricity, horrible local streets, and then you get into their houses and there would be these beautiful, minimal, modern structures that were created with a lot of enthusiasm and effort, and they were the most creative about the solutions of, this is the community that did not go and buy generators for their electricity. They had solar power panels. I would be visiting a studio, visiting an artist in this neighborhood, in these type of houses, and they would be showing me their work connected to the internet through the solar power. I was blown away by that. So these are the kind of changes that are also happening and has happened that is very, I think, different from the way that construction was sort of created by this aristocratic elite that you're speaking about. Although that Amanullah, who was an aristocrat too, was probably the most democratic. To me, he represented more a president than an actual king. He absolutely did not believe behaved really like a king, and which is why it was destroyed very quickly.